Hello, everyone. Welcome to the English Language Center's Trauma Informed Practices training. This will be a hopefully fairly brief training, but enough to get you started and feeling comfortable working with refugee students and clients. First off, what is trauma? Most simply, in the psychological sense, trauma is an event or series of events that overwhelms the central nervous system, leading to alterations in how a person perceives, processes, and remembers. This can be a single, sudden event, the result of long term, ongoing stressors. It can also be generational or even secondhand trauma. Trauma or a traumatic event isn't going to look the same for every person, but is equally valid. Teachers and volunteers in the classroom will most often see trauma impacting a student's ability to learn and retain information. You may also see students appearing to be disengaged or disruptive. In a case management or service provider setting, clients may have trouble remembering appointments, appear resistant to requirements, or have significant mistrust of systems and individuals. In any context, it's important that we check our assumptions and recognize that many trauma responses are survival strategies that have helped people in the past. It will take time to unlearn those coping mechanisms, and we can help with that by being patient. There are many potential sources of trauma that people can face, and more people than we might expect are working through trauma. Looking specifically at the refugee context, there are three obvious categories of potential trauma. I'm not going to go into detail on any of the sources, but in brief, the first source is from countries of origin. No one chooses to flee their home. The circumstances that have led to that flight are a source of potential trauma. The second is the flight itself. Again, without going into details, there is significant risk associated with fleeing from one country to another, seeking refugee status, and navigating the complexity of finding security. Finally, the refugee resettlement process itself is a significant source of potential trauma, both during the process of being accepted and resettled, and also during the process of adjusting to their new lives in the United States. Because we are aware of the significant potential for refugees to experience trauma, as refugee service providers and volunteers, we must also be aware of the impact that trauma has. Trauma physically changes the brain. When an individual has experienced significant trauma, their brain begins to interpret the world differently. It begins to see any increase in stress as a life-threatening situation and reacts accordingly. When someone is trying to survive, the instinctual part of their brain takes over and the ability to learn stops. You don't need to remember the word burn when your house is on fire. You just need to get to safety. In an actual survival setting, these reactions are life-saving and necessary. Outside of a life-threatening situation, these reactions are less useful. Unfortunately, the logical brain has already given the reins to the instinctual brain, and getting control back can be tricky. But it is possible, and we'll talk about that shortly. First, let's talk about the responses to stress and how you might see them manifesting. Many people have heard of the fight or flight as a stress response. There are also freeze, flop, and fawn. Fight is exactly what it sounds like. It's the reaction to fight for your life. However, it doesn't mean that a person in a fight response is going to start throwing punches, though it can. You're more likely to see people having overreactions to requests, seeming to bully others, especially if there's a perception of a resource scarcity, or even just moving around a lot more, being active and agitated. An example of this in the classroom. A student has a specific seat in class that they prefer. They usually arrive early and put their materials there to indicate that the seat is taken. One day, they arrive later than usual, and a new student has taken their seat. The student starts yelling at the newcomer, demanding that they move seats. This is an extreme reaction. Looking at it from the outside, we can see many better ways to react. But for the student yelling, they are seeing a stranger taking something that is theirs. In this circumstance, the teacher can talk to the yelling student and bring them to a calm area where they can recenter together. When the student is calm, they can return to the classroom and find another seat. In an incident like this, it's important to check on other students involved at an appropriate time. Make sure they're okay, explain the situation to them if needed. It isn't always possible to avoid trauma responses in the classroom or at an agency, but maintaining your own calm will give students and clients a helpful behavior to mirror. Flight is fleeing to safety, but this doesn't always mean literally physically running away, though again, it can. You may also see people avoiding topics, trying to change the subject, choosing to do different activities, or seeking distractions. An example of this in the classroom. A teacher has assigned a conversation activity. Students are given questions to ask each other about items in their house. A pair of students have stopped doing this and instead are talking about their plans for the weekend. When the teacher tries to re-engage them in the activity, one of the students goes to the restroom and doesn't return until the end of class. The teacher later realizes that both students had been staying in a hotel for months, and their decision to talk about something else was likely due to their frustration with their housing situation. This, and the one student choosing to leave the class, are both examples of flight responses. It's okay to see if students are willing to re-engage in an activity, but it's also important to respect students' agency and right to refuse. Freeze is the deer in the headlights response, when someone is so overwhelmed by options that they shut down and become incapable of action. This most often looks like disassociation, becoming withdrawn, and having trouble communicating. For example, during an activity in class where students are supposed to wander around and ask each other questions, the teacher notices that one of the students is still sitting at their desk and staring at their workbook. When the teacher goes over to talk to them, they startle and start to breathe rapidly. The teacher speaks to them in an even tone, redirects their attention to the workbook page they'd been working on earlier, and refocuses them on subject matter they're comfortable with. The teacher keeps an eye on the student for the rest of the class, and they appear to recover themselves and continue to follow the lesson as usual. In some instances, we aren't going to be able to pinpoint exactly what is causing someone to have a trauma response. It may not even be something in the classroom. Having strategies to calmly address responses and monitor students' well-being will help even if the cause is unknown. Fawning, sometimes called friending, is attaching to someone for safety. This can look like codependency, people-pleasing, an inability to say no, becoming quickly and overly attached to people perceived as willing to help. An example, during an enrollment assessment, a husband and wife test into different classes. When they are informed of their class placements, they insist on being together. The teacher explains that being in the same class will hinder both of their learning and assures them that the classes are at the same time, so they can still come together to school. They will just be in different rooms. The couple is still adamant on being in the same class. After discussing the issue with the other teachers, they decide to let the couple be in the same class. It is not uncommon for recently arrived students to want to stay in classes with family members, and it's not bad to accommodate that if we can. In this specific instance, listening to the needs of the couple and respecting their agency allowed us to build trust and respect with them. Pushing them to be in separate classes could have been fine, but it also could have led to them feeling unsafe and not attending classes. Finding the balance between honoring student or client perceived needs and programmatic requirements is tricky, but the effort is necessary. The flop response is surrendering for safety. It can be physically flopping, fainting, or falling asleep. It can also present as being disoriented or disengaged. It can look a lot like freezing, but the physiological mechanisms are different. We'll talk a little bit about that shortly. During a vocabulary review activity, a student who had been involved in the activity puts their head down on the table. When the teacher tries to re-engage them, they participate for a short time, then start to rest their head on the table again. The teacher recognizes that the student needs a break and skips the next turn for the next few turns of the activity. When the student sits up again, the teacher re-includes them. With any trauma response, it's important to give students or clients the space to experience what they're experiencing. Sometimes intervention will be required, either for their well-being or the well-being of other students and clients. Sometimes just letting them be and keeping an eye on them is the only thing they need from you. The most important thing is to maintain your own sense of calm and model that for others. I mentioned that flop and freeze can look similar. In reality, determining the exact label for a trauma response is rarely helpful in the moment. However, knowing the physiological things happening during responses is helpful foundational knowledge and can help you as you are trying to figure out what happened after an event. Fight, flight, and freeze are considered hyperarousal trauma responses. This is when your body is kicking into overdrive, sending a ton of survival signals, increasing heart rate and breathing. Your body is getting you ready to go, ready to react, even if it doesn't really have a plan for what that action should be. Fawn and flop are hypoarousal responses. This is when your body is so overwhelmed that it just stops. Freeze versus flop are good illustrations of this. A person who is freezing is tense. They're poised for action. They just can't decide what. A person who has flopped has given up. They have been so psychologically and physiologically overwhelmed that they surrender to the threat. None of these reactions are conscious decisions. They're instinctual. We've gone through some scenarios of trauma manifesting in classrooms and how you can respond. The things that we see most often are people appearing disengaged, feeling generally unwell, and the occasional outburst. We have also seen people self-medicating as a coping mechanism. Your role in addressing trauma responses, both in the moment and afterward, is going to vary depending on your position. The most important thing you can do is keep calm. That can be difficult if someone is having an extreme reaction, but if you can maintain your calm, you can be a model for others to mirror off of and find calm for themselves. For most responses, giving the person time and space to collect themselves is going to be the right course of action. Let them take a break from the activity. Let them step out of the room. Keep your eye on them, but move the attention of other students and clients away and allow them to continue what they were doing. That does not mean ignore the response, just give space and monitor. But what happens when giving space and monitoring isn't enough? If someone is having a severe enough response that they're disturbing others, they're unable to regulate themselves, what can you do? Again, remain calm. Humans instinctively mirror the attitudes and actions of those around them. If you react in a stressed manner, that will reinforce the other person's stress. Create as calm an environment as you can. Reduce noise, crowds, distractions. Keep your body language neutral, your tone calm. Use clear, simple language. Offering someone water is a good way to get their focus on something real and safe, and possibly address an underlying issue. Dehydration is a common cause of increased production of stress hormones. That can trigger a trauma response, even if nothing else seems to be wrong. We can never prepare for everything that can cause a trauma response. We can and should be mindful of the topics and materials we present, but we can't prepare for everything. What we can do is build trauma-informed practices into our everyday lives to create safe environments where, if something does happen, people are ready to recover. This starts with trust and respect, knowing students' or clients' names, being reliable and consistent, not making promises that you can't keep. These are good practices in general, but are doubly important for working with people who have experienced significant insecurity. Their experiences are telling them that trusting people is dangerous. Showing them that it's safe to trust us is the foundation of a healing relationship. Patience is also key. Unlearning trauma-based coping mechanisms is a long process, and students and clients are undergoing that process as we are also trying to teach them English, preparing them for employment, getting them to appointments, finding permanent housing. There is so much going on in their lives, so many responsibilities that we have, that patience can be hard to come by. It is on us to check our assumptions. It's easy to assign an explanation to someone else's behavior, but we don't actually know what's going on in their heads. All we can really do is treat people with the grace we would like to be treated with on our worst days. In the classroom or in meetings with clients, be aware. Pay attention to nonverbal cues and reactions. Try to avoid topics that commonly trigger trauma responses. We'll address those in a moment. And be flexible with your expectations and time, as much as you can. It's also important to take care of yourself in the moment and afterward. Make sure everyone who needs to be informed of an incident is informed, and make sure you take time for self-care. We've touched on this throughout, emphasizing student or client agency, highlighting choices, recognizing survival strategies, and being patient as people unlearn things that have served them in the past but aren't helpful now, encouraging growth and self-sufficiency. All of these things are foundational to trauma-informed practices. Here are some topics to avoid, especially as you are first building a trusting and respectful relationship with someone. Family is a big one. Many people have lost family members, have had to leave them behind, or have since been separated. Even discussing your own family can bring up painful memories and associations. Steer clear of this topic unless the person you're talking to brings it up first. Even then, avoid asking specific questions about their family. Similar thing with pets. Many cultures don't have the same relationships Americans do with animals, especially pets, but some do, and some have lost pets through the resettlement process. The country of origin. Some refugees are ready and eager to talk about their countries of origin. Others are not. Avoid asking details about where people have come from and absolutely avoid discussing current events, especially ongoing conflicts and natural disasters. The refugee journey. No one should feel pressured to talk about their past experiences, especially someone who has gone through the refugee experience. And injuries or health issues. Some people will have ongoing health issues that arose from the refugee experience. Others will have health issues that are not the result of the refugee experience. Regardless, even a well-intentioned "what happened" could be asking an individual to remember or talk about a difficult experience. Some general topics to avoid: politics. Both domestic politics and political situations in countries of origin can cause stress and heightened feelings of insecurity or a lack of agency. Religion. Many of our students were forced to flee their country of origin due to religious persecution. Even a well-intentioned invitation to a religious service or event, or offering non-religious services in a religious building, can cause significant insecurity and heightened mistrust. War and conflict. Avoid asking questions about ongoing or past wars and conflicts that students or clients may be impacted by. Also, keep in mind anniversaries of conflicts and events that might be particularly sensitive to students. Be prepared for them to require more grace around those anniversaries. Similarly with natural disasters. These are some topics to approach with caution. Depending on your role, you may have to discuss these things with clients, but doing so with patience and respecting student and client agency is going to be very helpful in the discussion. For housing situations, obviously we can't avoid talking about housing situations, finding new housing, teaching students about housing-related English. However, we should be aware that this can be a very sensitive subject due to the loss of previous homes and current housing insecurity or difficulties. Similarly, we often have to discuss employment, job searching, the American workplace. However, this is an area where many students and clients are experiencing current difficulties on top of the loss of previous careers. An unfortunate reality of the current resettlement system is that it often requires refugees to accept jobs they are significantly overqualified for, and this limits personal agency. Now that I've talked a lot about what not to ask, here are some generally safe topics. Things in the present. The weather, what someone did over the weekend, or their plans for next weekend, hobbies. These are good topics that allow students to direct the conversation toward what they're comfortable with. When working with individuals who may have experienced trauma, it's, again, important to stay aware and in tune with the conversation and nonverbal clues. Show patience, check your assumptions, and give people the benefit of the doubt. We're all just doing our best. Thank you so much for your attention. As I said, this was a brief intro to trauma-informed practices. If you have any questions or would like more information, please feel free to reach out for me. You can see my email on the screen. Thank you again for your attention.